and the Forest Grove quintuple homicide. Early Saturday morning, firefighters were sent to a quiet rural property outside Forest Grove, Oregon. The original call sounded straightforward. A vehicle was on fire, but within minutes, the situation changed completely. Firefighters reached the property on Northwest Otis Lane and discovered human remains. Law enforcement was called. Then investigators began searching the property. One victim became more. By the time authorities understood the scale of the scene, 5 people were dead. Several domestic animals were also found dead, and police were no longer investigating a fire. They were investigating 5 suspected murders. But that was only the beginning. For more than a day, authorities revealed very little about what they had found. They would not identify the victims. They would not say where on the property the bodies had been discovered. They would not explain how the vehicle fire was connected to the deaths. And although investigators said they did not believe the violence was random, they also acknowledged something deeply concerning. Whoever they believed was responsible was not in custody. Then came the next major development. Detectives identified a suspect, 36-year-old Benjamin Charles Parker. Investigators tracked him across state lines to Enumclaw, Washington. But when police located Parker's vehicle, they did not find a suspect they could question. They found Parker dead inside. Authorities believe he died by suicide. Now the immediate search for a suspect may be over, but the central mystery is not. Who were the 5 people found on that isolated Oregon property? What connected them to Benjamin Parker? What happened before that vehicle caught fire? And perhaps most importantly, what evidence led investigators from a secluded property outside Forest Grove directly to Parker in another state? This is what we know so far. And just as important, this is what investigators still have not explained. NA. The case began before sunrise on Saturday, August 22, 2026. At approximately 5:27 in the morning, Washington County Sheriff's Office deputies were called to assist the Forest Grove Fire Department. The location was 407-350 Northwest Otis Lane. It sits in an unincorporated area of Washington County, outside Forest Grove, west of Portland. This is not a dense suburban neighborhood. The surrounding area includes farmland, hills, vegetation, and wooded properties. According to local reporting, Northwest Otis Lane is a dead-end road. From the road, the property itself is difficult to see. That isolation would soon become important for investigators processing what authorities described as an unusually large and complicated scene. The first emergency call involved a vehicle fire. Firefighters arrived first. Exactly what they saw has not been publicly described in detail. Officials have deliberately withheld information about the condition of the vehicle and the location of the victims. But firefighters encountered what they considered suspicious circumstances. They discovered human remains and requested law enforcement. Radio traffic reported by KATU captures how quickly the situation appeared to escalate. At first, firefighters were reporting one deceased person. Then there was discussion of a second victim. Soon afterward, the scene was turned over to law enforcement. What had begun as a fire response was becoming something much larger. As deputies and investigators examined the property, they ultimately found 5 deceased people. They also found several dead domestic animals. Authorities have not publicly said what types of animals they were or how many were found. They have also not disclosed whether the 5 victims were discovered together or in different areas of the property. And that distinction matters, because one of the biggest unanswered questions remains the role of the burning vehicle. Was the fire connected directly to one or more of the deaths? Was it started after the killings? Was it intended to destroy evidence? Or was its relationship to the homicide entirely different? At this point, investigators have not publicly answered those questions, and there is no responsible basis to guess. By Saturday afternoon, the law enforcement response had expanded significantly. A drone was seen being used at the scene. A mobile command unit was present. Multiple agencies became involved. The Washington County Major Crimes Team joined the Sheriff's Office investigation. The Oregon State Police Crime Lab sent forensic personnel. The Sheriff's Office deployed its own forensics and evidence specialists. Search and rescue personnel assisted. So did a remotely operated vehicle team. A crash reconstruction team was involved. The tactical negotiations team supported the operation. The Washington County Digital Forensics Lab was also part of the response. and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives was among the agencies assisting. That list does not tell us exactly what investigators found, and the involvement of a particular agency should not be treated as proof that a particular weapon or method was used. But it does tell us something about the scale of the investigation. Authorities were dealing with far more than a single body in a single room. They had 5 victims, dead animals, a vehicle fire, a large rural property, and potentially multiple types of physical and digital evidence. Washington County Sheriff Caprice Massey later described the scene in unusually strong terms. She said that in her 22 years with the agency, she had never been part of or witnessed a scene quite this complex involving this kind of investigation. That statement immediately raised another question. What made this particular scene so complex? Was it simply the number of victims, the size and terrain of the property, the condition or locations of the remains, the presence of the vehicle fire, or evidence that required several specialized teams? Authorities have not said, and for investigators, silence at this stage can be intentional. Releasing certain details too early can interfere with witness interviews, contaminate tips, or reveal information that only someone connected to the crime should know. No. For the public, however, the lack of information created understandable concern. More than 24 hours passed before authorities publicly confirmed the full scale of what had happened. When officials finally held a news conference on Sunday, Detective Shannon Wild said investigators were treating the deaths as a 5-person homicide. At that point, the sheriff's office still had not publicly identified the victims. Their ages and genders were not released. Their relationships to each other were unknown publicly. Their causes of death had not been announced. Authorities were still working to confirm identities and notify relatives. Detective Wild explained that this was one reason information had taken time to release. 5 deaths create an enormous logistical challenge. Investigators had to process the property while also identifying the dead and attempting to reach their families. But officials did reveal one critical conclusion. They did not believe the killings were random. That changed the way the case looked. If the victims were deliberately targeted, investigators would naturally begin examining their relationships, recent contacts, movements, communications, and anyone connected with the residents. Who had been at the property? Who knew the people living there? Who had spoken with them recently? Who had a reason to visit? And who was missing from the scene? At the Sunday news conference, investigators urged anyone familiar with the residence or its occupants to contact them. Sheriff Massey emphasized that no detail was too small. At that stage, authorities also acknowledged that no one had been arrested. Detective Wild told reporters that investigators believed someone responsible for the act was still not in custody. Residents were advised to take normal precautions, lock their doors, and report suspicious activity. But investigators continued to stress that they did not believe this was a random attack. Then the case changed again. And later Sunday, the Washington County Sheriff's Office announced that detectives had identified a suspect. Benjamin Charles Parker, 36 years old. The sheriff's office has not publicly explained what evidence caused investigators to focus on Parker. That is one of the most important pieces of this case that remains hidden. Was Parker connected personally to the people at the property? Was his vehicle recorded somewhere? Did investigators recover digital evidence? Did phone data point to him? Was there evidence at the property identifying him? Did witnesses provide his name? At the time of this recording, authorities have not said. What they have confirmed is that their investigation led them to believe Parker was in Enumclaw, Washington. That meant the investigation had now crossed state lines. Police in Enumclaw located Parker's vehicle. Inside, they found Parker dead. According to the Washington County Sheriff's Office, investigators believe he died by suicide. Officials then announced that they no longer believed there was a danger to the public. But Parker's death creates a major problem for investigators. They may have identified the person they believe was responsible, but they cannot question him. There can be no interrogation about what happened at the Oregon property, no direct explanation of his relationship to the victims, no account of what happened before the emergency call, no answer from Parker about why a vehicle was burning when firefighters arrived. Instead, investigators will have to reconstruct those answers through evidence. And that makes the forensic work underway in Oregon even more important. The digital side of the investigation may become especially significant. The Washington County Digital Forensics Lab was among the teams assisting. That does not tell us what devices or records investigators possess. But in a case where the suspected offender cannot be interviewed, digital evidence can help establish a timeline. Phones can potentially show communications and movements. Messages may establish relationships. Location information can help investigators determine where people were during important periods. Vehicle data, surveillance footage, or electronic transactions may also help fill gaps. Again, authorities have not said which, if any, of those forms of evidence exist in this case. But the central investigative challenge is clear. Police must establish what happened without relying on the suspect to tell them. They also have to determine whether anyone else played any role. At this stage, the sheriff's office has identified Parker as the suspect and says there is no ongoing danger to the public. There has been no announcement of another suspect, but the investigation remains open. And then there is the question of the victims. 5 lives are at the center of this story. Yet right now, almost nothing about those people has been released publicly, and that absence matters. In developing cases, there is often a temptation to fill missing information with online speculation. That would be especially dangerous here. We do not yet know whether these victims were members of one family. We do not know whether all of them lived at the property. We do not know their relationship with one another. And we do not yet know their relationship with Benjamin Parker. Until authorities or the families confirm those facts, anything beyond that would be speculation. The same caution applies to the owner of the property. OPB reported visiting a Portland address connected through property records to the listed owner. A detective's card had reportedly been left at that location, and neighbors said police had been there. But when reporters asked investigators about the property owner, Detective Wild declined to discuss it. That does not establish that the owner was a victim. It does not establish that the owner was a suspect. And it does not establish who was actually living at the Forest Grove property when the killings occurred. For now, it is simply another part of the case investigators have chosen not to explain publicly. 1. So what can we say with confidence? A 911 caller reported a vehicle fire early Saturday morning at a rural property outside Forest Grove. Firefighters responded. They discovered human remains and called law enforcement. A search of the property ultimately revealed 5 deceased people and several deceased domestic animals. Investigators classified the case as a 5-person homicide. They said the attack did not appear random. A massive multi-agency investigation followed. Authorities initially said the person responsible was not in custody. Then detectives identified 36-year-old Benjamin Charles Parker as their suspect. Their investigation led them to Enumclaw, Washington. Police found Parker's vehicle there. Parker was found dead inside in what authorities believe was a suicide. And law enforcement now says there is no known danger to the public. Those are the established facts. Everything beyond them remains part of an active investigation. And the unanswered questions are substantial. First, who are the 5 victims? Second, what was the relationship between those victims? Third, what connected Benjamin Parker to the property or the people found there? Fourth, when did the killings occur? The emergency call came at 5:27 Saturday morning, but authorities have not publicly established when the victims died. Fifth, how were they killed? No causes of death have been announced. Sixth, why were several domestic animals also found dead? Seventh, what role did the burning vehicle play? And eighth, what evidence allowed investigators to identify Parker and track him to Washington so quickly? The answers could fundamentally change how this case is understood. There is another question investigators may eventually need to answer. What happened between the events at Northwest Otis Lane and Parker's discovery in Enumclaw? If Parker left Oregon after the killings, investigators will likely want to establish his route and movements. That timeline could help determine when he left the property and what happened afterward. But until law enforcement releases that evidence, it remains an open part of the story. This is where the investigation now stands. The immediate threat that concerned residents on Sunday appears to have passed. But identifying a suspect is not the same as explaining a crime. In some ways, Parker's death makes those answers harder to obtain. The 5 victims cannot tell investigators what happened. and the man police identified as their suspect cannot be questioned. That leaves the physical scene, the digital evidence, the vehicle, the forensic findings, the medical examiner's work, witnesses, and the relationships surrounding the property. Piece by piece, investigators will have to reconstruct what happened before firefighters arrived on Northwest Otis Lane that Saturday morning. And when the victims are identified, this case will change again. Because 5 anonymous entries in a homicide investigation will become 5 individual people. People with families, histories, relationships, and lives that existed long before a burning vehicle brought emergency crews to that secluded property. For now, Washington County investigators are still asking anyone familiar with the residence, the people who lived there, or their associates to come forward. This remains an active investigation, and some of the most important facts have not yet been released. So the question is no longer simply, who was the suspect? Police believe they have answered that. The bigger question now is, what happened at that rural Oregon property before dawn? And what evidence will finally explain why 5 people never made it out alive? This is CaseNex. If investigators release the victims' identities, the suspected motive, forensic findings, or new details about Benjamin Parker's connection to the property, we will follow those developments carefully, because this case is not finished. The man police identified as the suspect may be dead, but the investigation into what happened on Northwest Otis Lane is only beginning.